information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Today I'm speaking to Doug French, who's senior editor at Laissez-Faire Books and a former president of the Mises Institute in the United States. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning.
I thought it would be interesting if we asked Doug, who has an almost unrivaled knowledge of Austrian school publications in the last few years, if we asked him to put together for us a short list of books to help the uninitiated become scholars in the Austrian school, particularly with regards to monetary matters. So Doug's given me a list of 10 books on money, which somebody might be able to read over a year or two in order to become kind of fully conversant with the Austrian school. So here we go with the list. Coming in at number 10, down from number 11, we have The Ethics of Money Production with Guido Hulsmann. Doug, why do you like this one?
Well, this is a book I've used a lot in preparing a number of articles and talks over the last couple of years. And although there's plenty of history in here and the reader will understand the evolution of money and how the government has, degraded it, if you will, I think the most interesting part of Professor Hulsmann's book is a chapter on the cultural and spiritual legacy of fiat inflation. And what he describes very effectively is the morals of society, the savings habits of society. Everything goes down the tube with monetary inflation. And the practical man in the past with hard money would work, put away some gold every pay period or every month. Now we're stuck with having to become conversant in the stock market. We're watching financial news programs. We're having to figure out whether we should be in bonds or stock. Do we ride the boom? Do we wait it out? We never quite know. And it's the fiat money system that always stands in the way of wealth for the average person.
Yeah, in Victorian times, people just used to have to save gold, didn't they? Their gold coinage. And then gradually, as the Industrial Revolution took hold, prices came down and down and down. So when people retired, they just took their gold out of savings and it was worth more at the time. So inflation has destroyed that, hasn't it?
Exactly. I think what Professor Hulsmann does is describe this process very clearly. It's not necessarily the book I would start with, but I think it is a very, very interesting book for your listeners to pick up and peruse and certainly focus in on what Hulsmann's done that I can't think of another author who's really fleshed this out quite the way he has.
Do you think they should start then with number 9, which is What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray Rothbard?
Well, yeah, Murray's book, this is a short book. I think it's just over 100 pages, more or less. But Murray Rothbard, Murray is very close to my heart because I was a student of Murray's at University of Nevada at Las Vegas. I took my master's under him. We became good friends. He was just a wonderful guy. But this is really there's a couple of books in here I would start with, but this is certainly one of them. What has government done to our money? Because it takes you from essentially barter through the fiat money systems that government has taken over. He covers lots and lots of ground with this book, but it is very short. And if your listeners have not read Murray Rothbard, they are going to be thrilled that an economist can write this well. His prose is very punchy. He's got a great sense of humor, and he's just like the man that he was. What you read is the way he was, and this is a wonderful, wonderful book to get started with.
Is it true he called you his efficient banker?
Yeah, he did call me the efficient banker. Of course, when he said that, I was working on my thesis under him, and I had a lot of course, I had to work during the day, and I had to write the thesis. And part of the thesis process is taking it around to your various committee members, getting them to sign off on stages of it. And I guess I was fairly adept at, dotting I's and crossing T's and getting these things done. So I think that's why he hung that moniker on me.
Okay, I think that brings us to my favourite book from your list of 10, and that's coming in at number 8. We have The Mystery of Banking, again by Mr. Murray Rothbard.
Well, this book is very, very near and dear to my heart. In fact, this book was out of print. I bought 2 copies through search sites for rare books, and I think I paid upwards of $400 for one of the copies, and pretty close to that to the other copy. Then the opportunity arose back when I was able to help the Mises Institute republish this book. The Institute did that a few years ago. This is a book that was so hard to get that when I heard about it, I found a copy in the UNLV library, and I stood over the copy machine for an entire Saturday morning, feeding dimes into this copy machine to make a copy of it. And that's the only copy I had for a long time until I was able to find these copies in the secondary market. Now it's online for free at the Mises Institute, and certainly paper and ink does not cost that much anymore with this new edition. This is a book that probably most clearly describes fractionalized banking. And that's a term that your average person, in fact, your average banker, has never heard that term. They don't understand it. They don't understand what banks do with the money. Murray lays that out very clearly, very methodically. And then, of course, it takes a central bank to backstop this entire system. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful book that I would recommend to everybody.
If I was actually a conspiracy theorist, I would suggest that the Illuminati went around the world stealing these copies of this book to prevent people finding out about this, about fractional reserve banking particularly. And I'd like to thank you for paying for its republication yourself, which was a great piece of work. Anyway, let's get to number 7, which is another Murray Rothbard book, The History of Money and Banking in the United States. Now, why is this useful to people, even those who live outside the United States?
Well, I think that, and again, as the name implies, this is a history book. So you're not going to get the technical aspects of money and banking. And that is, I guess this goes from colonial times, I think, to World War II. But what is going to be interesting for the reader, no matter where they are, is the political aspects of how bankers collude with government for their favors, if you will. And I think that was very apparent as you read through the first central banks that were created in the United States. And those failed. Andrew Jackson did away with one of them. And then what Murray lays out is how the Federal Reserve was really created. It is really more of a political history than anything else, but I think that people should read and understand. The other part of this book that I think is important is that the 1870s in the United States is described by many economists and many historians as this terrible, terrible period for the economy in the United States. And what Murray goes back and does is really show that it was actually a very prosperous period in terms of economic growth. Yes, there wasn't inflation. You had a gold standard. The booms of 1873 were being liquidated, but it set the stage for this wonderful regeneration of the economy that, again, is described by many historians as this very dark period in the United States, and it was anything but. This is really Murray as the historian, and I think people will really enjoy it.
The Keynesians did the same after World War II, didn't they? When all the troops came home in 1945, there was actually a boom in the United States. But if you use Keynesian figures like GDP figures and all these other things, which were boosted during the Second World War, it seems to be a dark period. And yet people can actually remember that period actually being a boom time. So they did the same thing for that Victorian period, and yet it was more of a good time than it was a bad time. Okay, number 6. Now, this is an interesting one because it's early speculative bubbles and increases in the supply of money. It's by a certain Mr. Douglas French. Now, why has this one appeared in our list?
Well, the listener's going to think that I'm carrying my own water, and I'm going to apologize for the train going by right now. But Andy and I decided to put this on the list because there is a tremendous monetary aspect to this book. This is my thesis that I wrote under Murray, and I also had Hans Hoppe on my thesis committee, so I had tremendous help in preparing my thesis and in turn this book. This is about 3 periods: the Tulip Mania piece, or the Tulip Mania period in Amsterdam, John Law's Mississippi bubble, and then the South Sea bubble. And again, all these bubbles, as I show in this book, were created by excessive money creation. Interestingly, in the case of Tulip Mania, because the Bank of Amsterdam had 100% reserves, because they had a free coinage policy, it attracted specie and clipped coins from all over Europe. And so you had this tremendous amount of good hard money that was going into Amsterdam, which fueled the speculation in tulip bulbs with John Law. And of course, in the case of the South Sea bubble in Britain, it was exactly the opposite. You had just tremendous money supply growth, and of course, tremendous supply and the number of shares being created. So dramatically different periods, but it's a very interesting study that I think readers would enjoy.
I love the genuine American economy sounds going into the background there in Alabama, which is fantastic. So the American economy is actually still working a little bit.
Well, the trains are, I don't know if they're running on time, but they're certainly running. We have about 18 that run here through Auburn a day. So we're right next to the tracks.
Lovely. What I like about your book is the fact it deals with a hard money inflation, if you will, because everything else that we've seen in Austrian books is about paper money, which can just be printed. But this was actual hard silver money from the Bank of Amsterdam. Yet you beautifully explain how you can have a hard money bubble as well as a paper money bubble.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I wouldn't say there's necessarily controversy about my thesis, but it wasn't necessarily accepted, even in the Austrian community. Murray urged me to try to get the tulip mania part of my thesis published in a mainstream journal. And I made 8 or 9 attempts. I was turned down every time. And then he said, well, it'll certainly be published by the Quarterly Review of Austrian Economics. Unfortunately, he died before he could usher that through. Eventually, it was published in the QJ, as it's known, and the book's been published. But it's taken a while for this idea to really take hold.
Yeah, and what you explain quite well, which I'll let people read, getting the book, which is freely available from the Mises Institute as a PDF, is the 3 government interventions which enable a hard money bubble to arise. Okay, let's get on then to number 5, and we're going back to our roots now. So we have The Origins of Money by Carl Menger.
This is a book, and it's a tiny book. So I think for people just getting started, I think this is an interesting book to pick up. And Carl Menger is really the father of Austrian economics. I think you hear the name Ludwig von Mises often, and Murray Rothbard and F.A. Hayek, but it really all began with Carl Menger, and he really started the entire Austrian thought. And this book really tells you where money came from. Money did not come from government edict. It comes from the market. So Menger uses his subjective value theory to, again, methodically take us through the process of how marketable goods emerge in a marketplace to become money. Again, very, very short book, very easy book to read, and something that people should pick up who are just getting started.
Von Mises then took those ideas to create number 4 on our list, which is Human Action. Now, this is a monstrous, huge book, which nearly devoured me when I first read it. I had to read it a couple of times. Can you tell us why it's good for money as well as why it's good for everything else?
There's a lot in it about money. And again, as you say, it's a monstrous book. I'm not sure anybody listening to this who has no familiarity here. Please don't try Human Action at home. You know, probably the way to dip into it might be to pick up Bob Murphy's study guide and take a look at that and have him kind of guide you through the book. Actually, there's 3 books on our list that we're getting to that Bob Murphy, who's a great young Austrian scholar, has done study guides to. But Human Action, the thing that I always remember about it is something that Murray said. And somebody asked Murray Rothbard, what's Human Action about? And Murray said, it's about everything. And when people describe economics, you know, they get into all kinds of convoluted description of what economics is. But Ludwig von Mises had a 2-word answer, and it was human action. So this book is really about the entirety of economics, which is all human action. There's lots about money here. We're going to get to number 1 on the list, which is, again, a Ludwig von Mises title. But there's just wonderful, wonderful sections about money within human action.
After I read Human Action and unwrapped the wet towel from my head, I then ordered Man, Economy and State, and then 2 very strong men lifted it from the postal wagon to the front of my house and delivered it. And I thought, oh no, not another one. But this one I think is actually much easier to read. So can you tell us about number 3 then, Man, Economy and State, again by Murray Rothbard?
Man, Economy and State was Murray's attempt to really take human action and boil it down for the average person. And he wrote this when he was a relatively young man. I think he was in his mid to late 20s, which is just unbelievable when you read book. And the current Mises Institute version of Man, Economy, and State also has the third volume, which wasn't originally published that way. So that is definitely the issue to get. And again, this is a book that is much more than about money. I mean, there's plenty about money in here. There's plenty about the evolution of money and where money has gone. There's plenty about banking in here, but there's just so much more. Murray Rothbard was not only an amazing thinker, but as I said before, he's an amazing writer. And so this is a big book, as you just described, but again, a very, very easy read. And if somebody wanted to pick up a big book and dive into it and isn't necessarily familiar with the literature, this would probably be the one I'd recommend because, again, Murray is such a good writer.
Yeah, if we were going to do sequels, you might do What Has the Government Done to Our Money and then go straight into Man, Economy and State, I would think.
Exactly, yeah.
Was Power and Market the third part of the new edition?
Power and Market is probably the book that I used most often back when I was in Nevada and writing for a policy institute there. Power and Market talks about the effects of taxes and government intervention so effectively that you can virtually, for anyone who's in the policy area, not that Murray was a policy wonk, but he can so effectively explain the effects of government intervention that any time that, your local government is proposing a new tax, you can pull open the Power and Market section of Man, Economy, and State, and you will get Murray's take on what the effect of that tax is going to be or what the effect of that intervention is going to be. Again, just great work by Murray, and that's my favorite part of Man, Economy, and State.
Yeah, it's a superb book and very well written. It just flows through, whereas Human Action is much harder work. Okay, coming on to number 2 then. Now, I think this is a sequel to Mystery of Banking. This is Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles by Jesus Huerta de Soto. Can you tell us about this book?
This is a monster of a book, and you just get everything with this. It's got history. It's got just an amazing integration of Austrian theory and the business cycle and money. There's an extraordinary section of the book that I've used that describes the attempt to legally justify fractional reserve banking. Because when your listeners understand what fractional reserve banking is, which is essentially a bank is entrusted with your deposit, but they don't keep it around. They turn around and lend it out to someone else. And through this, money is created. And their hope, of course, they hope and they pray that not everybody shows up for their money right away because it's all gone somewhere else. So you might immediately say, well, this is fraud. And what Huerta de Soto does so effectively is has this wonderful history of how politicians and judges and bankers get together to collude to legally justify fractional reserve banking. It's much more than that. I'm just pointing to a small section of the book. This is a book that you really just curl up and wrap yourself around and spend a lot of time with. He's a brilliant, brilliant scholar, a terribly energetic man who is producing wonderful scholars there in Madrid. And he's also an insurance company executive. So this is not just a fuzzy-headed academic. This is a guy who operates in the real world as well. He works in the morning and early afternoon, goes home, takes a proper Spanish siesta, and then is teaching all night long. Just a wonderful scholar and, like I say, a very energetic guy. And this is really an amazing book.
I love all the Roman history and how it took the state hundreds and hundreds of years to take away our kind of legal rights and our legal rights to property in order to create fractional reserve banking. So if anybody likes history as well, I think it should have been called The History of Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles. No,
that's a great point about the Roman history because I can't think of another book that really gets into that. So I think that's a very unique part of Huerta de Soto's book.
Yeah, a marvellous book. Okay, that brings us then to the big one, number 1. In its centennial year, A Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, this is the granddaddy of them all, if you will. And like you say, this is it was 100 years old this year. This is, again, not probably for the faint of heart. Mises is not necessarily an easy read. And again, I would point out that Robert Murphy, who's done some great work for the Mises Institute, he's essentially an independent scholar, does a lot of writing, a lot of online teaching. He's written a wonderful primer to theory of money and credit, and that may be a great way to start. But what Mises has done here is essentially integrated subjective value theory with money creation, and of course banking, to show that how fiat money, fractionalized banking, create these tremendous booms and busts in the business cycle. It's essentially the theory that F.A. Hayek built upon and that F.A. Hayek earned a co-Nobel Prize with.
Another marvellous book, and I think those 10 books together, if somebody hasn't read any of them, that should keep somebody busy for quite a while. Okay, how are you finding working at Laissez-Faire Books?
Well, it's wonderful. It's essentially Jeff Tucker, who probably a few of your listeners know. He did great work for the Mises Institute for 25 years, and we worked together there for about 3.5 years. But he's rebuilt Laissez-Faire Books into this wonderful enterprise right now. We have Laissez-Faire Book Club, the Laissez-Faire Club, where people can get a free download of these wonderful books on liberty and economics. Every Friday, you get a new book, and this is all for $10 a month. And we're also going to be adding additional club levels, where we're going to be offering some live classroom opportunities for people to learn economics. I mentioned Bob Murphy earlier. He'll be teaching for us. We're going to have some great instructors that are going to be a part of our next level of membership. So it's growing quite nicely. It's great to make a living with this great literature. We produce, an article every day about essentially current events and our take on it. And so we're part of the Agora financial family. A lot of your listeners are going to know Agora. They've been in the financial newsletter business for a long time. Bill Bonner is a pioneer in that area, and he's an amazing writer in his own right. Edison Wiggin has written some wonderful books on monetary economics himself. So it's great to be a part of the Agora family, and it's great to have Laissez-Faire Books and Laissez-Faire Club off the ground nicely.
You're actually bringing out a couple of books at the moment on money, aren't you? There's one, Good Money, and then Ron Paul's Case for Gold.
Good Money this is a book written by George Selgin that the Independent Institute published a couple of years ago, and it's actually about private coinage. And this is a little-known piece of history from Britain that he's just done a wonderful job with, that essentially Gresham's Law sucked all the silver out of Britain, but you still needed small coinage to do transactions. So who stepped in? Was it the government? Oh, it wasn't the government. The government didn't step in. It was private enterprise. And so you had these various, whether they be button makers or die casters or whatever business they got into, they also got into the coinage business. And they made some of the best coinage in history. It withstood counterfeiting much more effectively than government money did. And so it's a wonderful book for people to pick up, and we certainly carry it at Laissez-Faire Books. We have probably some of the last remaining hardback copies if people still like their paper and ink with a hardback around it, and come to lfb.org and pick up a copy. But it's a wonderful book. If we have time, I'd like to make a mention about something that I mentioned in the book review about Good Money, and that is a report created by the ECB on virtual currencies. I make reference to that because there's all kinds of talk about Bitcoin and other virtual currencies. And, some people listening might say, why do I have to learn about money? Well, I think, as this ECB report points out, the Bitcoins of the world are going to be, they may really start to define and put pressure on the idea of, does money really just come from government? I think most people assume that, but I think Bitcoin is going to put that whole idea into question. And so that's an interesting report to read. And I think as you read these great books, whether it be Rothbard, whether it be Mises, whoever it might be, I think having an understanding of money in this modern era is going to give you some insight as to what happens going forward, because the private market is probably, as central banks denigrate currencies all over the world, the private market is doing all it can to step in and create better money.
The thing about Bitcoin is very shrouded in mystery, isn't it? I'll have to find someone to speak to about it. But speaking of the case for gold by Ron Paul, I believe you've had a bit of a local election in the United States today. What do you think of the result of that election?
Well, it's the same old, democracy, this theory that the mass of people get what they want. And as Mencken said, H.L. Mencken said, they get it good and hard. I think the American public, year after year in elections probably gets what they deserve on a national level. You can probably say it on a worldwide level. I mean, Russian voters electing Putin, French voters electing Hollande, a guy who immediately lowers the retirement age, increases the minimum wage, and puts an onerous tax on the most productive in France. I mean, these guys their economics policy and knowledge is just astounding. But the public, democracy is this idea that people are going to pick one sociopath over another. Maybe
Monsieur Hollande should write a book called Human Inaction.
Yeah, I think that's what he's going to have. He's going to have human inaction over in France, and Europe needs exactly the opposite. They need lower taxes and, less government interference. This is just more of the same. We're getting more of the same in the United States. I posted last night during the election results. Obama's kept the White House. The Republicans have kept the House. The Democrats, the Senate, the Keynesians have kept the Federal Reserve, so the beat goes on. And I think that's the way it's going to work out.
Well, hopefully Obama can bring some change in the next 4 years for you. Thank you very much, Doug Friends, for your time this morning.
Andy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.
Professor Holzman's book is a chapter on the cultural and spiritual legacy of fiat inflation. And what he describes very effectively is the morals of society, the savings habits of society. Everything goes down the tube with monetary inflation. And the practical man in the past with hard money would work, put away some gold every pay period or every month. Now we're stuck with having to become conversant in the stock market. We're watching financial news programs. We're having to figure out whether we should be in bonds or stock. Do we ride the boom? Do we wait it out? We never quite know. And
a short list of books to help the uninitiated become scholars in the Austrian school, particularly with regards to monetary matters. So Doug's given me a list of 10 books on money, which somebody might be able to read over a year or two in order to become kind of fully conversant with the Austrian school. So here we go with the list. Coming in at number 10, down from number 11, we have The Ethics of Money Production with Guido Hulsmann. Doug, why do you like this one?
Well, this is a book I've used a lot in preparing a number of articles and talks over the last couple of years. And although there's plenty of history in here and the reader will understand the evolution of money and how the government has, degraded it, if you will, I think the most interesting part of...
With number 9, which is What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray Rothbard.
Well, yeah, Murray's book, this is a short book. I think it's just over 100 pages, more or less. But Murray Rothbard, Murray is very close to my heart because I was a student of Murray's at University of Nevada at Las Vegas. I took my master's under him. We became good friends. He was just a wonderful guy. But this is really there's a couple of books in here I would start with, but this is certainly one of them. What has government done to our money? Because it takes you from essentially barter through the fiat money systems that government has taken over. He covers lots and lots of ground with this book, but it is very short. And it's the fiat money system that always stands in the way of wealth for the average person.
Yeah, in Victorian times, people just used to have to save gold, didn't they? Their gold coinage. And then gradually, as the Industrial Revolution took hold, prices came down and down and down. So when people retired, they just took their gold out of savings and it was worth more at the time. So inflation has destroyed that, hasn't it?
Exactly. I think what Professor Holzmann does is describe this process very clearly. It's not necessarily the book I would start with, but I think it is a very, very interesting book for your listeners to pick up and peruse, and certainly focus in on what Holzman's done that I can't think of another author who's really fleshed this out quite the way he has.
Do you think they should start them?
The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Today I'm speaking to Doug French, who's senior editor at Laissez-Faire Books and a former president of the Mises Institute in the United States. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning.
I thought it would be interesting if we asked Doug, who has an almost unrivaled knowledge of Austrian school publications in the last few years, if we asked him to put together for us